July 12, 1944, Western France. Village square 12 kilometers east of Saint-Lô. 93 civilians stood in the center of the square. Men, women, children. They had been assembled there for 40 minutes. German infantry surrounded them in a loose perimeter, 22 soldiers with rifles held at port arms. 2 MG-42 machine guns were positioned on opposite sides of the square, mounted on bipods, angled toward the center. Ammunition belts fed into the receivers. Gunners sat behind the weapons, hands resting on the grips. A hauptmann stood near the church steps. He held a piece of paper. His face showed nothing. The paper had been delivered by motorcycle courier at 14:35 hours. He had read it twice. Now he stood, looking at the civilians, then at the paper, then back at the civilians. His jaw was tight. He had not yet spoken. The soldiers waited, the civilians waited, the machine gunners waited. No one moved. The square was silent except for wind moving through damaged buildings and the distant sound of artillery from the Saint-Lô sector. The hauptmann folded the paper and placed it in his tunic pocket. He looked at his watch. It was 15:17. He did not give an order. He did not move. The guns remained aimed. The civilians remained standing. Time stopped advancing. The village had been occupied by elements of the 352nd Infantry Division since June 9, 5 days after the Allied landings. The unit had withdrawn from coastal positions under sustained pressure and established defensive lines inland. The village sat astride a secondary road used for supply movement between German positions. Its tactical value was minimal, but it provided shelter and a temporary command post for the battalion staff. Resistance activity in the area had increased through late June and early July. Sabotage of communication lines, ambushes of isolated patrols, and intelligence gathering by local networks had been documented. On July 10, a motorcycle courier had been killed 2 kilometers north of the village. His dispatch case was taken. The following day, a supply truck was disabled by a concealed explosive on the road west of the village. No casualties, but the incident delayed movement for 6 hours. Division headquarters issued standing orders regarding reprisal actions. Villages where resistance activity occurred or where perpetrators were sheltered were subject to collective measures. The specific language in the orders used terms like severe action and deterrent measures, without explicit instruction. Local commanders were expected to interpret and execute within the framework of German military procedure and occupation policy. The hauptmann commanding the company in the village had received the courier message at 14:35. The message originated from battalion headquarters and referenced the July 10 incident. It stated that intelligence indicated the village had provided support to resistance operatives. The message directed the hauptmann to assemble the civilian population and execute reprisal measures in accordance with standing orders. Time of execution was left to his discretion. Confirmation of action was to be reported by 18:00 hours. The hauptmann had assembled his platoon leaders and relayed the order. He then directed soldiers to gather the civilians. They were brought from homes, shops, and fields. The process took 30 minutes. By 15:10, 93 people stood in the square. The machine guns had been positioned. The perimeter was established. Everything was ready. The hauptmann had the authority, the means, and the order. Standard procedure dictated immediate execution. German military doctrine regarding occupied territories emphasized control through visible enforcement. Resistance activity was to be met with immediate and disproportionate response. This doctrine was codified in multiple directives issued through 1943 and 1944. Commanders at battalion and company level were familiar with the expectations. Hesitation or leniency was viewed as weakness that invited further resistance and undermined occupation authority. The hauptmann had been an infantry officer since 1940. His service included campaigns in Poland, France, and the Eastern Front. He had witnessed and participated in operations involving civilian populations. The procedures were known. When orders specified reprisal measures, The execution was expected to be swift, public, and complete. The logic was deterrence. Demonstrate overwhelming consequences to discourage future resistance. His soldiers were experienced combat troops. Most had served on the Eastern Front, where similar operations had been conducted routinely. The psychological conditioning required to execute such orders had been established through years of continuous operations in hostile territories. The moral framework that permitted such actions was reinforced through military culture, propaganda, and the normalization of violence in occupied zones. The machine gunners had positioned their weapons with clear fields of fire. The MG-42 was capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute. At this range, less than 30 meters, accuracy was absolute. The engagement would last seconds. The ammunition belts contained sufficient rounds to ensure no one in the square would survive. The procedure was mechanically simple and tactically straightforward. Battalion headquarters expected confirmation by 18:00 hours. Failure to execute the order would require explanation. The hauptmann understood the command structure and the consequences of disobedience. His career, his reputation, and potentially his own safety depended on compliance with orders from superior authority. Refusal was not contemplated within the system. Orders were given. Orders were followed. This was the fundamental principle of military organization. The civilians understood none of this in detail, but they understood enough. They had been gathered at gunpoint. They saw the machine guns. They saw the soldiers. Some of the children were crying. Most of the adults stood silent, faces blank. A few looked at the hauptmann, waiting. Everyone waited. The expectation was universal. Violence was imminent. The only question was when. At 15:21, the hauptmann walked to the nearest machine gun position. He stopped behind the gunner. He stood there for perhaps 5 seconds. The gunner did not turn around. His hands remained on the weapon. His eyes stayed forward, fixed on the civilians. The hauptmann did not give the order. He walked to the second machine gun. He stood behind that gunner as well. Same posture, same silence. Then he walked back to the church steps. He removed the paper from his pocket. He unfolded it. He read it again. His lips did not move. His expression did not change. He refolded the paper. He looked at his watch. 15:23. He looked at the civilians. He looked at his soldiers. He put the paper back in his pocket. He turned and walked toward the command post building at the north end of the square. His pace was normal, not hurried, not slow, just walking. He did not look back. He did not call for anyone to follow. He simply walked away from the square and entered the building. The soldiers remained at their positions. The machine gunners did not move. The civilians stood motionless. No order had been given. No action had been taken. The square remained frozen. Time resumed, but nothing changed. The soldiers looked at each other. An Unteroffizier commanding one of the infantry squads glanced toward the building where the hauptmann had entered. He did not follow. He did not approach the other squad leaders. He remained at his position, rifle held across his chest, watching the civilians. Minutes passed. 5, 10. The civilians began to shift their weight, adjusting posture after standing motionless for so long. A child asked a question in French, audible but not understood by the German soldiers. A woman placed her hand on the child's shoulder. Silence returned. One of the machine gunners turned his head slightly, looking toward the Unteroffizier. The Unteroffizier made a small gesture with his hand, a motion that meant wait, stay in position. The gunner turned back to face forward. His hands remained on the weapon, but the tension in his shoulders had decreased slightly. The immediacy of action had passed. Something had changed, but no one knew what. At 15:38, a lieutenant emerged from the command post building. He was the hauptmann's second-in-command. He walked to the Unteroffizier and spoke briefly. The conversation was too quiet to be heard by others. The Unteroffizier nodded. The lieutenant walked to the second squad leader and repeated the conversation. Then he walked to each machine gun position and spoke to the gunners. Orders were given quietly. Stand down, return to normal security posture, release the civilians. The words were neutral, procedural. No explanation was provided. The soldiers began to move. The machine gunners disengaged the ammunition belts and secured their weapons. The perimeter dissolved as soldiers returned to their assigned posts. The civilians remained standing, uncertain whether they were permitted to move. The lieutenant addressed them in broken French. "Go home, stay inside, no movement after dark." His tone was flat. The civilians began to disperse slowly. Some walked quickly. Others moved in small groups, keeping close together. Within 10 minutes, the square was empty except for the soldiers dismantling the machine gun positions and returning equipment to storage. The hauptmann did not reappear. He remained in the command post building. No announcement was made. No assembly was called. The event simply ended, dissolving into the routine activities of occupation: patrols, guard rotations, equipment maintenance, meal preparation. The hauptmann's written report, filed with battalion headquarters at 17:45 hours on July 12, stated that upon further investigation, evidence linking the village population to resistance activity was insufficient. The report noted that the July 10 incident occurred 2 kilometers from the village, outside the immediate area of civilian movement. The report further stated that the July 11 incident involved a road used by multiple villages, making attribution to this specific location uncertain. The report recommended increased patrols and stricter curfew enforcement, but concluded that collective reprisal measures were not warranted given the lack of definitive evidence. The report requested clarification of evidentiary standards required before executing reprisal orders. It was signed by the hauptmann and countersigned by the battalion commander without comment. What occurred between 15:17 and 15:38 in the command post building was not documented. The hauptmann's decision-making process was not recorded. However, subsequent testimony from the lieutenant, given during post-war proceedings in 1947, indicated that the hauptmann had expressed concern about the intelligence basis for the order. He had questioned whether the village population could be reliably connected to the specific incidents cited. He had stated that executing the order without clearer evidence would constitute a procedural violation. This reasoning was tactical and legalistic, not moral. The hauptmann did not argue that the order was wrong in principle. He argued that the evidentiary standard had not been met. This distinction was significant within military procedure. Orders could be questioned on procedural grounds without challenging the authority structure itself. The hauptmann was not refusing an order. He was requesting clarification before execution, a recognized command prerogative when operational details were ambiguous. Battalion headquarters did not challenge the hauptmann's report. The clarification request was not answered directly, but no follow-up order was issued. The matter was effectively closed through administrative silence. The hauptmann's interpretation became the operational reality. The reprisal was not executed because the hauptmann determined that procedural requirements had not been satisfied. This decision was individual but operated within systemic constraints. The hauptmann used existing procedural mechanisms to avoid executing an order he deemed insufficiently justified. He did not openly defy authority. He navigated the bureaucratic structure to achieve non-action while maintaining formal compliance with military protocol. The outcome was 93 lives preserved, but the method was procedural delay rather than direct refusal. The village returned to occupied routine. Curfew was enforced at 20:00 hours. Patrols increased in frequency. Identity checks became more thorough. The German presence became more visible and more restrictive, but no further reprisal actions were initiated. The hauptmann's company remained in the village for 8 more days before withdrawing south as Allied forces advanced. The civilians did not celebrate. They returned to their homes and resumed daily activities under the constraints of occupation. Some understood how close they had come to being killed. Others did not fully comprehend what had been prepared. The silence was complete. No one discussed the assembly in the square. No one acknowledged what had almost occurred. Survival required avoiding attention. Questions were dangerous. Silence was safer. Among the German soldiers, the incident was not discussed openly. Some understood that an order had been given and then not executed. Others assumed the order had been rescinded from higher command. The distinction did not matter operationally. They had been prepared to carry out the order. They had been relieved from that requirement. The moral weight of what they had been prepared to do was not examined. It simply became another event in the continuous sequence of orders given and orders followed. The hauptmann resumed normal command duties. He conducted briefings, inspected positions, and coordinated with battalion headquarters on routine matters. His demeanor did not change. He showed no indication that July 12 had been exceptional in any way. His interactions with subordinates remained professional and procedural. The decision he had made was not referenced or explained. It existed only in the administrative record as a report filed and acknowledged. By July 20, the company had withdrawn from the village entirely. Allied forces occupied the area on July 22. The village suffered some damage during the advance but was largely intact. The civilian population remained. Life continued. The event in the square on July 12 receded into memory, remembered by those who had been present but not discussed, not recorded in local accounts, not marked in any way. No official recognition of the hauptmann's decision was ever issued. Military records from the 352nd Infantry Division show routine operational reports for July 12, 1944. The hauptmann's name appears in personnel rosters and command logs, but without notation of exceptional action or disciplinary proceedings. The incident left no mark on his service record. Post-war investigations conducted by Allied authorities and later German judicial processes examined numerous war crimes involving civilian populations. The hauptmann's unit was investigated as part of broader inquiries into 352nd Division activities. However, the July 12 incident was not among the charges examined. No crime had occurred. No evidence existed of wrongdoing. The investigation found nothing because there was nothing to find: no bodies, no witnesses to atrocity, no documentation of completed reprisal action. The hauptmann's written report remained filed in division archives until those records were captured in 1945. The document was catalogued but not analyzed in detail. It appeared to be routine correspondence regarding operational procedures. The significance of what did not happen was invisible in the archive. The gap between what was ordered and what occurred was evident only to those who had been present and understood the sequence of events. The civilians who had stood in the square did not file formal testimony. The village had no official record of the assembly. Local memory preserved the incident in fragments, stories told within families, remarks made decades later, vague recollections that something had happened but details were unclear. No monument was erected. No commemoration occurred. The event was too ambiguous, too incomplete, too quiet to generate memorial action. The silence was structural. Violence generates documentation. Its absence generates nothing. The hauptmann broke protocol not through dramatic refusal but through bureaucratic procedure. He filed a report that reinterpreted the order's requirements. Higher command accepted that reinterpretation. 93 people lived, and the entire sequence left almost no trace. The hauptmann survived the war. He was captured by American forces in April 1945 and held as a prisoner until 1947. Post-war denazification proceedings classified him in a mid-level category, neither leadership nor follower. He was released and returned to civilian life in Western Germany. He worked in administration and died in 1968. His death was noted in a local newspaper with a brief obituary that mentioned military service but provided no details. The lieutenant who had relayed the stand-down order also survived. He testified during war crimes investigations in 1947, providing information about division operations. His testimony included a brief mention of the July 12 incident, describing it as an example of the hauptmann's careful attention to proper procedure. The testimony occupied 3 paragraphs in a much longer statement. It was not examined further. The lieutenant emigrated to South America in 1949. His later life is not documented. Of the 93 civilians in the square, at least 67 were confirmed to have survived the war. Some died in subsequent fighting as the front moved through the region. Others survived into old age. A few gave interviews to local historians in the 1970s and 1980s. References to July 12 were fragmentary. We were gathered in the square. There were guns. Then they let us go. No detailed accounts were recorded. Memory had softened and simplified the event into a moment of fear that passed without consequence. The village itself recovered slowly. Reconstruction took years. The square was repaved in 1953. The church was repaired in 1956. By the 1960s, the physical traces of occupation had largely been removed. New generations grew up without direct knowledge of what had occurred. The story of July 12, when it was told at all, became simplified into a narrative of the German officer who didn't shoot us. The complexity and ambiguity dissolved into a general sense that something bad almost happened but did not. No historical marker was ever placed. No academic study examined the incident in detail. The hauptmann's name does not appear in published histories of the Normandy campaign or analyses of occupation policy. He remains anonymous, one officer among thousands who made decisions during the war that are now lost to record. July 12, 1944, was one day among thousands during the war. In villages across occupied France, similar assemblies occurred. Some ended differently. Some ended the same way. The outcomes depended on individual decisions made by individual officers operating within structures that permitted enormous discretion and enormous violence. The hauptmann broke protocol by interpreting an order in a way that allowed him not to execute it. He used procedural language to create space for inaction. He did not refuse. He did not rebel. He simply filed a report that reframed the situation in terms that made execution unnecessary. Whether this was calculated or instinctive, whether it reflected reluctance or merely procedural caution, cannot be determined from available evidence. 93 people walked away from a square where 2 machine guns had been positioned to kill them. They returned to their homes. They lived through the rest of the war or died in other circumstances unrelated to July 12. The moment when they stood waiting for death became part of their personal histories but left no mark on the broader historical record. The hauptmann walked away from the square and filed a report. He continued his duties. He survived. He returned to civilian life. He died without public acknowledgement of what he had chosen not to do. The decision was quiet, bureaucratic, and ultimately invisible. It saved lives but generated no evidence of having done so. The gap in the record is the only trace. An order given, a report filed, and nothing in between except the silence of an action that did not occur.